Hey guys, tonight we step straight into the eerie winds of the medieval night, where something as simple as a breeze could send people scrambling for a priest or clutching a charm made from dried bat wings. You're standing in a damp, muddy village square. The air smells faintly of smoke, manure, and fear. There's a wind curling around your ankles, light, but sharp, and someone near you mutters, "The witch's breath." Just like that, your stomach tightens. Back then, wind wasn't just weather. It was an omen, a delivery system for evil. People believed spirits rode on air currents, like ghostly hitchhikers. If you felt a sudden gust on a calm day, it wasn't just weird weather, it was a warning. Demonic forces, they said, could ride that breeze into your home, slide under your door, or even sneak into your mouth while you slept. Honestly, you probably won't survive this night. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your city and local time in the comments. I love seeing where in the world we're drifting off together from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge along a dirt path between thatched cottages, and every now and then, someone opens a shutter and spits outside, not out of rudeness, but to repel evil. See, it's common knowledge around here that witches can ride the wind, blowing sickness into homes like seeds scattered across a field. If your cow dies, or your child wakes up with a fever, don't blame bacteria. Blame ill wind. That's the term. And it was taken very seriously. Wind was invisible, uncontrollable, and came from out there. And anything from out there was suspect. Medieval villagers weren't dumb, they just lacked microscopes. They knew sickness spread through contact, sure, but also believed disease could hover in the air, like an unseen fog. Miasmas, they called them, foul airs that brought death. Historians still argue whether this belief in miasmas was more superstition or proto-science. Either way, it made every breeze suspicious. Now, remember, this is a time when churches were also laboratories of fear. Priests would walk through fields, swinging censers full of incense, literally trying to push back the evil air. A bishop might even declare a fast day if the wind smelled funny. They'd ring church bells. Those sacred sound waves were thought to cleanse the air, like divine Lysol. Yes, really. The bell toll wasn't just to mark time, it was to terrorize demons. One quirky twist. Some folks believed certain winds came from the mouths of saints or angels. The north wind, for example, was feared, but also respected, because it was said to be God's whip. Harsh, biting, and purifying. On the other hand, the east wind was viewed with suspicion. It comes from the place of the dead, they'd whisper, which might explain why they always built graveyards on the west side of town. So spirits would have to fight the wind to get in. Here's where it gets darker. There was a particular term floating around in church sermons and whispers, the witch's breath. It was the idea that a witch could curse you simply by breathing on your door, or worse, on your food. People would cover their mouths when passing a suspected witch, or hold a clove of garlic under their nose, like some kind of medieval Vicks VapoRub. And no joke, if you sneezed near someone and they crossed themselves? That wasn't for manners, it was for defense. Winds weren't just spooky, they were a literal threat vector. One peasant record tells of a village in Bavaria where a sickly wind rolled through during a feast. People began vomiting, livestock dropped, and suddenly, everyone was convinced a witch had been among them, riding the gusts like a plague. They burned 2 women before the wind even died down. Another strange belief? That demons could whisper on the wind and possess people. If you stood alone too long outside, with no bells ringing and no fire nearby, and suddenly heard voices on the breeze, well, you better start praying or sprint home. Many monks wrote of temptation breezes, literal whispers of sin that clung to lonely travelers. Whether those were psychological episodes, dehydration, or actual hallucinations, we'll never know. Want a real kicker? Wind direction was even tied to moral judgment. South winds were considered lascivious. People believed they stirred passions, caused adultery, or led monks astray. Theologians debated this. One even wrote a whole treatise titled, On the South Wind and the Nature of Temptation. Yes, someone seriously blamed bad behavior on geography. Oh, and if you thought closing the windows would help, think again. Many homes didn't have glass, just wooden shutters or cloth. That meant the air, and whatever rode in on it, was always welcome. Imagine trying to sleep while wondering if tonight's breeze was a holy whisper or a demonic giggle. The irony? In some areas, people actually bottled air. Yep. They'd bless it, seal it in a leather pouch, and wear it around their neck. Clean air from the cathedral, they'd say. Kind of like spiritual Febreze. Others hung bundles of herbs and animal bones from their rafters to catch bad wind like flypaper. Fringe. Sure. But when your only defense is superstition, you get creative. You pass a field where scarecrows aren't just for birds. They're dressed like priests, robes, crosses, and all, meant to scare off air demons. And no one plows during windstorms, it's bad luck. The soil, they say, will remember the evil and poison your wheat. So tonight, as you listen to your own modern fan humming gently in the background, think about how, for centuries, that same sound would have made villagers bolt their doors and pray for morning. Because in their minds, every breeze had a face, and most of them were frowning. You wake in the middle of the night to the weight of something pressing on your chest. You can't move. You can't breathe. Your eyes dart, but the room is dark, except for the vague outline of a hunched figure squatting on your ribs. Its hair is long, its eyes wide, and you can feel its cold breath on your cheek. You try to scream. Nothing comes out. Welcome to the world of nightmare cats and soul-stealing hags. Medieval folk had no word for sleep paralysis, but they knew the experience intimately, and they hated it. They called it the mare, the root word for our modern term nightmare. This wasn't a bad dream. This was a creature. A real one. The mare was thought to be a demon or spirit that crept into bedrooms under cover of night and sat on your chest, whispering awful thoughts, stealing your breath, or worse, stealing your soul. Basically, sleep paralysis, but with horns. And if it wasn't a mare, it might have been a cat. Not your purring, spoiled house pet, mind you. No, these were demon cats, familiars of witches, or even witches themselves, shape-shifted for a nightly prowl. If your baby died in the crib, or you woke up gasping for air, the explanation was simple. A cat snuck in and stole your breath. Why? Well, cats were believed to be drawn to the breath of infants, which, apparently, tasted sweeter than that of adults. Logic? Questionable. Fear level? Off the charts. There are records, actual legal records, of cats being tried and executed. A cat burned at the stake in 13th century France, another hanged in a village square in Cornwall. Why? Because they were suspected of being hags in disguise. And hags, you see, weren't just old women. They were supernatural assassins. The classic old witch imagery, the hunched back, warty nose, gnarly hands, comes in part from these night hags. Believed to fly through keyholes or ride along cold drafts, they'd land on your chest and paralyze you with wicked intent. Some said they fed off your life force. Others believed they planted nightmares in your head like seeds, hoping they'd blossom into sins. Either way, you woke up sweating, gasping, and looking around for hoofprints on your pillow. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were rooted more in folklore or church fearmongering. Probably both. But the mare and the hag became so feared that entire rituals were created to keep them out of your bed. For instance, sleeping with a knife under your pillow was common. Not to stab anyone, just to ward off evil. Iron was thought to disrupt magic. Some folks even sprinkled salt in the corners of their bedrooms, in case a spirit tried to sneak in. And don't forget shoes. Putting them under the bed, toes pointing outward, might confuse the hag enough to leave you alone. Or at least give her a foot fetish. But perhaps the strangest and quirkiest remedy of all? Placing a broom across the door. Apparently, hags had a compulsion to count things. So instead of attacking you, the hag would get stuck counting the bristles on the broom until sunrise, when her powers faded. It's basically the medieval version of distracting a vampire with spilled rice. Creepy and oddly adorable. Now, remember those demon cats? In some regions, it was believed they didn't just sit on you, they danced. Yes, danced. On your chest. In circles. Slowly grinding your lungs down to pancakes while humming little tunes only cats can hear. That may sound laughable now, but when you're jolting awake in the dark, unable to breathe, with a cat perched on your blankets, it stops being funny. And here's a fun detail for your next trivia night. In parts of Scandinavia, people believed hags could ride horses to death. Literally. Your horse would be fine one day, and the next it would be exhausted, sweaty, trembling. The explanation. A hag had taken it for a midnight gallop across the sky. Farmers started hanging amulets in their stables. Small silver crosses or herbs like St. John's wort, said to protect both horse and human from night visitations. The church, of course, didn't help. They amplified the fear, linking these experiences directly to Satan's influence. If you suffered frequent attacks, it was your fault. You must have sinned. Or worse, consorted with witches. In one tragic case from the 14th century, a young woman in Prague claimed nightly suffocation by a hag. The townspeople responded not with sympathy but suspicion. They accused her of attracting demons, and she was cast out. She died a few weeks later of exposure. Just a bad dream, right? And while some educated monks wrote off the mare as phantasms of the night, others chronicled these events with disturbing detail. One even described being unable to move while a bony woman, with burning fingers, touched his heart. He survived the night, but only after placing a relic of Saint Michael under his pillow. Whether that relic was real or not, we'll never know. But he claimed the attacks never returned. If you're wondering why these myths stuck around for centuries, think about how vulnerable you feel at night. Alone. Still. Unconscious. The idea that something could invade that safety and control your body, even for a moment, is terrifying, and universally understood. We all wake up sometimes feeling pinned, disoriented, breathless. Medieval people just happened to have names for it, and stories to match. And yes, sometimes those stories got darkly specific. One tale from 15th century Germany tells of a boy who kept a pet cat named Lisbeth. He began suffering nightmares, night after night, until one morning he awoke to find Lisbeth sitting perfectly still, staring at him, unblinking. He told his mother, who immediately drowned the cat in a sack. That night, the dreams stopped. Or so they say. Even today, echoes of these beliefs linger. In Icelandic folklore, the Mora still shows up. In Newfoundland, there's the old hag, an entity blamed for sudden nighttime panic. And here you are, lying in bed, maybe remembering a night when you couldn't move, when your body felt frozen, your chest heavy, your mind wide awake. You tell yourself it was nothing. But hey, maybe double-check that the door is locked. And just in case, flip your shoes so the toes face the wall. The village is unusually quiet tonight, and that silence isn't comforting, it's thick, tense. People avoid each other's eyes. No music drifts from cottages. No laughter. Just that whisper, someone's heart stopped in the woods. And no one's asking why. Because they already know. A fairy took it. Now, let's be clear, when you hear fairy, you might picture something dainty, sparkly, maybe voiced by a British actress in a Disney movie. But in medieval Europe, fairies were terrifying. Mischievous at best, deadly at worst. These weren't cute little forest dwellers, they were unpredictable, otherworldly, and not quite right. They could twist your mind, steal your baby, or lure you into the trees where time warped and no one ever found your bones. You pass a ring of mushrooms on the path. Innocent looking, but everyone gives it a wide berth. That's a fairy ring. Step inside, and poof, you vanish. Or worse, you reappear 100 years later, unchanged, only to find your entire village gone, your name forgotten, your cow turned into a pub. Historians still argue whether fairy belief was rooted in pre-Christian pagan deities or born from pure folk terror, but one thing's certain, people believed, and they were terrified. Here's a mainstream historical fact for you. In 1325, in a village near Kilkenny, Ireland, a woman named Aine was blamed for causing illness among children. Her crime? Walking through a fairy glade without permission. The townsfolk believed she had offended the good folk, and that her mere presence was a curse. She wasn't a witch, just unlucky enough to cross the invisible line between our world and theirs. The term good folk, by the way, was used ironically. People believed that calling fairies by their real names would draw their attention, never a good thing. So instead, they buttered them up with polite euphemisms. You might leave a bowl of milk by your door each night, not for a cat or ghost, but for the invisible guests who'd otherwise mess with your livestock or cause your teeth to fall out. If the bowl was still full in the morning, you panicked. If it was empty, you breathed easy. Weird logic, but again, you're dealing with creatures who might turn your intestines into fiddle strings if offended. Want something even more bizarre? There was a time people feared fairy midwives. Yes, fairy midwives. The belief was that fairies, being unable to birth their own young, would abduct human women to assist in secret deliveries deep underground. These women would wake up with strange bruises, dirt under their fingernails, and no memory, except maybe a vague recollection of crying that sounded off. If a woman vanished for a night and returned dazed, she hadn't run away. She'd been borrowed. Now, the scariest version of these myths? Changelings. The idea that a fairy could sneak into your home and swap your baby with a fake one. A doll, a sickly creature, or an old fairy disguised as a child. If your baby cried too much, or didn't seem to grow right, it wasn't colic, it was a changeling. And the remedies were brutal. Some parents left the child outside overnight in the cold, believing the real baby would be returned. Others exposed the imposter to fire, hoping the pain would force the fairy to break character. In some tragic cases, the result was infanticide, cloaked in superstition. Quirky twist. Not all changelings were evil. Some were just nosy. One Welsh tale describes a man raising a changeling who eventually taught him secret songs from the fairy realm. It didn't stop the livestock from dying, but the guy at least became locally famous for his harp playing. So, there's that. Back to the forest path. You hear bells, not church bells, but soft, chiming ones, like they're coming from 100 tiny ankles. You freeze. The air feels thick, slightly warm, and then colder than it should be. That's another sign of fairy presence, sudden environmental shifts. Dogs refuse to enter certain groves. Birds go silent. Your candle flickers without a breeze. These signs were taken seriously, and people built their entire lives around avoiding them. In Ireland, roads were sometimes diverted to avoid fairy forts, ancient ring-shaped structures. Even today, construction projects are occasionally paused due to superstition. It sounds wild, but you try explaining to a villager in 1350 why tearing up a fairy mound for a new well is totally chill. Spoiler, you'd probably end up cursed, or worse, employed as a scarecrow. Want to hear something worse? Some people claimed to have been taken by the fairies and returned. These touched folk were often odd, distant eyes, strange habits. They were feared and pitied, believed to have knowledge they couldn't share. They'd mutter names no one knew, or scream in languages that didn't exist. And always, they feared music. One tale tells of a man who tore out his own ears after hearing a harp string vibrate, saying, "I won't go back." You know, casual post-traumatic fairy stress. And then there's the idea of time slippage. Enter a fairy glade, spend what feels like a night dancing and drinking, and come back to find your entire family dead of old age. That story shows up again and again in different cultures, from Celtic to Slavic folklore. You get the sense that the fairies weren't just mischief makers. They were cosmic pranksters with a really messed up sense of humor. So when someone in your medieval village whispers about a man who wandered into the forest and came back, strange, no one asks too many questions. They just draw a cross on the door and move his bed closer to the hearth. You, meanwhile, keep walking, praying the bells fade behind you. And if you ever stumble on a fairy ring, whatever you do, don't step inside. Just trust me on that one. You keep walking, hugging the edge of the woods now, and you start to notice something else. Faces carved into the trees. Not friendly ones, either. Long, sharp, twisted features. Some grimacing, others howling. You pause to study one and realize it's not just art. It's a warning. You've just wandered into demon country. In medieval times, demons weren't lurking in hell, they were lurking everywhere. That strange knocking in your attic? Demon. Your crops failing after a bad prayer? Demon. Woke up with a mysterious rash on your arm? Surprise. You guessed it. Demon. There were thousands of them, each with a name, personality, and a preferred method of harassment. They didn't just possess people. They ruined days, broke marriages, flattened soufflés, and corrupted dreams. Basically, they were the medieval version of a Wi-Fi outage, except with claws and Latin names. Let's start with incubi and succubi, two of the most disturbing demons to grace any folklore. The incubus was a male demon who'd creep into your room at night and assault women in their sleep. The succubus did the same, but to men. No one could agree exactly what their goal was, but the popular theory was that they were stealing vital energy, or worse, creating hybrid demon-human offspring. You know, classic romance stuff. Historians still argue whether these legends were based on sleep disorders, guilt-driven hallucinations, or just convenient scapegoats for unfortunate pregnancies. Either way, a lot of candles got lit over it. And this wasn't just whispered lore, it was church-approved terror. Demonology, the study of demons and how to resist them, was taken very seriously. Think of it as a cross between theology and ghost-busting. The Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487, even catalogued ways to detect and destroy demons, and witches of course. Spoiler, most of the solutions involved prayer, torture, or dunking someone in a river until they stopped floating. But here's a quirky twist, some demons were considered manageable. Like Beelzebub, the so-called Lord of the Flies. People feared him, sure, but they also named flies after him and hung dead ones in their homes to keep him away. Because obviously, nothing deters a demon like a poorly taxidermied housefly. Demon sightings were common enough that monks kept diaries about them. In one 12th century account from France, a monk described waking to find a black, goat-headed creature staring at him from the foot of his bed. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stared. He prayed until sunrise, and it vanished with the morning light. You might write that off as sleep paralysis, or maybe an overactive imagination fueled by too much wine and too little daylight, but for that monk, it was real. And he wasn't alone. The belief in demons also spilled into architecture. Ever wondered why cathedrals have those snarling stone creatures hanging off the roof? Gargoyles weren't just fancy rain spouts, they were guardians. People believed their grotesque appearance scared off demons. Kind of like putting a scary clown doll on your front porch so burglars think you're the threat. And it didn't stop there. In some regions, churches installed demon traps. Yes, actual traps. They might be decorative ironwork over a doorway or complex mazes of symbols built into the stone floors, all designed to confuse or imprison evil spirits. If you're thinking that sounds excessive, remember that the stakes were supposedly eternal torment, so, yeah, bring on the stone mazes. Let's not forget about possession, which, to the medieval mind, was disturbingly common. If you had seizures, mood swings, or talked to yourself in the street, people assumed a demon had taken up residence in your body. There are records of entire villages gathering to watch exorcisms, sometimes lasting hours, sometimes days. People screamed. Holy water flew. At one point in Bavaria, there was a trend of hanging garlic around the necks of livestock, just in case the cows started mooing in Latin. In one recorded exorcism from 1456, a teenage girl was said to levitate 3 inches above her bed. Eyewitnesses claimed she spoke with a man's voice and knew secrets about people in the room. When asked how many demons were inside her, she answered, 7. A coincidence, or someone with Sunday school attendance and a flair for drama? Hard to say. But she was eventually cured after 3 days, and the priest was hailed as a hero. The girl was sent to a convent. Probably never looked at a goat the same way again. Now, here's a strange one, alleged demon dances. There are reports, especially in Eastern Europe, of people spontaneously breaking into frenzied dances, sometimes for days. The church called it possession. Modern scholars suggest ergot poisoning, a hallucinogenic fungus found on moldy bread. So basically, some of the demons may have been yeasty hallucinations. Not exactly the devil's most cunning disguise. Still, if someone acted weird enough for long enough, people assumed they were either cursed or in league with hell itself. Enter the sin eater. In some rural areas, when someone died, a local outcast, often a beggar, would be paid to eat a ritual meal over the body. The belief was that this meal absorbed the dead person's sins, cleansing their soul. Which sounds oddly noble, until you realize the sin eater became a walking buffet of spiritual grime. People avoided them in the street. Never made eye contact. Kind of like the medieval equivalent of your browser's incognito history. And remember, not all demons looked demonic. Some appeared beautiful, even angelic. Temptation was their game. A beautiful stranger shows up in your village, promises you secret knowledge or unearthly pleasure. Congrats, you just got demon-fished. By the time you realize your livestock are dead and your teeth have fallen out, it's too late. So you pass under the shadow of a chapel, and you instinctively hold your breath. Just for a second. You don't know why. Maybe it's habit. Maybe it's fear. Maybe it's the way the wind shifts when you're not alone. Because if medieval lore teaches you anything, it's that the devil doesn't announce himself. He just waits. Smiling. Patient. Maybe even behind that next tree. You step out of the shadow of the chapel, only to see something odd in the sky. Not a star, not the moon, but a faint, flickering light, like a wandering spark far above. A will-o'-the-wisp, perhaps? Or worse, an omen. In medieval times, people didn't just fear what walked the earth. They feared what hovered, loomed, and stared down from above. The heavens weren't just for angels, they were for monsters, signs, and 1,000 skybound superstitions. And none were more bone-chilling than the fear of cosmic punishments. You glance up again, but this time your heart skips. Because back in 1348, someone just like you looked up, and saw something burning through the night sky. A great ball of fire, like a comet, blazing, unnatural. And that year, the Black Death began. Coincidence? Maybe. But to the minds of medieval folk, the connection was certain. Comets were bad news, period. They weren't just flaming rocks, they were God's angry punctuation. Here's a mainstream historical fact. The Great Comet of 1066 was witnessed just before the Norman invasion of England. People didn't think, oh neat, astronomy. They thought, well, England's cursed now. And then, bam, Harold got an arrow in the eye, and William the Conqueror changed everything. Cause and effect, if you ask a medieval astrologer. Back then, astrology wasn't just a fun hobby involving apps and memes about Mercury retrograde. It was serious business. Kings hired court astrologers to read the heavens before battles. Birth charts were used to determine personality, temperament, and even how likely you were to be possessed by demons. Remember those guys? Historians still argue whether these astrologers truly believed their own predictions or just knew how to read a room and a terrified monarch. But let's talk about the real sky terrors, eclipses. Imagine you're a peasant farmer, and one day, without warning, the sun just disappears. It's noon, and suddenly the world darkens. Birds go quiet. The air chills. You stare up, slack-jawed, clutching your rosary beads like a lifeline, and whisper a prayer you barely remember. That's an end-time moment. Many believed eclipses were signs of divine wrath, warnings of war, famine, or plague. In 1230, an eclipse passed over Paris, and by the following winter, the city was knee-deep in a deadly flu. Correlation, or coincidence, doesn't matter to the terrified minds of the time. To them, the skies were speaking. And the message: you've messed up. Big time. A quirky belief? Some thought eclipses were caused by dragons. Yes, literal sky dragons munching on the sun or moon. And the only way to scare them off? Bang pots and pans. Make noise. Shout. Light fires. A full-on neighborhood anti-dragon rave. People would run into the streets yelling, throwing ashes, or setting hay on fire. Not to celebrate, but to save the sky. And surprisingly, every time, the eclipse ended. So clearly, it worked. Right. Other ominous signs included red moons, blood moons, as they were often called. These crimson spheres sent chills down spines. A red moon meant war was coming. Or famine. Or that witches were gathering in the woods, whispering secrets to the wind. People would stay indoors, shut their windows, and pray until the color faded. You might laugh now, sitting comfortably with your star map wallpaper, but imagine being in a thatch-roofed cottage with no weather app and no understanding of light refraction. It was pure terror, backlit and moon-shaped. And if you saw 3 suns in the sky, yes, that was a thing, you didn't marvel. You panicked. These were known as sundogs, caused by ice crystals in the atmosphere. But to medieval eyes, it looked like the Holy Trinity had literally split up. One account from 1520 described villagers in Germany crying in the fields when the phenomenon appeared. They thought the final judgment had arrived. Spoiler, it hadn't. But their crops still died from a frost that spring. So, close enough? You might think the church had all the answers, but even priests sometimes panicked. One abbot famously fled his monastery during a meteor shower, declaring, "The stars are falling. Judgment is upon us." He came back 3 days later, embarrassed, but also a bit smug, because 2 monks had died of a fever during his absence. Coincidence? Or celestial validation? There were even sky sounds. Reports of thunder with no storm, voices carried on the wind, and disembodied music. One French legend speaks of a shepherd who followed the sound of invisible trumpets for 2 days before returning home with white hair and a stutter. And yes, he insisted he heard angels. Or demons. Or maybe just the beginning of madness. Scholars still debate whether these tales were based on actual weather phenomena, like thunderclaps or meteors, or just a really bad batch of barley ale. Now here's a bit of fringe folklore: sky coffins. In Slavic regions, people sometimes reported seeing what they called death parades in the clouds, rows of ghostly figures walking silently above the trees. Often right before someone in the village died. Maybe it was mist, maybe smoke, maybe just an unfortunate cloud shape, but the effect was the same. People shivered. Dogs howled. And windows were locked tight. You look up again, just to check. The sky seems fine now. Stars blinking peacefully. Moon doing its thing. No dragons. No coffins. No 3-headed suns or falling angels. Just you and a cool breeze. But you understand now, don't you? Why they feared the sky. Why they never trusted a shooting star or a red dawn. When you believe that heaven is watching and judging, you don't just watch the skies. You read them. Every flicker. Every shadow. And tonight, the air smells just faintly of ash. Was that a comet you saw earlier? Or just your tired eyes? You keep walking, just a little faster now. Because the sky may not fall, but in the Middle Ages, it definitely meant something when it moved. Your path winds down into a shallow valley now, where the mist clings thicker, and the air smells like damp stone and iron. In the distance, you catch the flicker of a lantern, or is it a torch? But there's no one holding it. Just a slow, bobbing light weaving between the trees like it has a mind of its own. You don't call out. Not here. Because this is where the souls wander. And in the medieval world, the line between the living and the dead wasn't just thin, it was crowded. Let's talk restless spirits. To you, a ghost might be a fleeting shadow in a hallway or a weird chill in the room. But to a medieval villager, ghosts were active neighbors. The dead weren't gone, they were simply on a different shift. And if they had unfinished business, you'd know. Loudly. The classic ghost story back then wasn't about a haunted castle or a cursed mirror, it was about the revenant. These weren't translucent, sheet-wearing specters. Revenants were corpses that walked, talked, knocked on doors, and sometimes throttled people in their sleep. They weren't quite zombies and they weren't quite vampires, but they were all kinds of wrong. One widely reported case from the 12th century describes a man who died in a Yorkshire village but was later seen walking at dusk. People claimed he smelled of rot and whispered threats in a language no one recognized. When his grave was exhumed, the body was bloated and ruddy-faced, classic signs, they believed, of post-death mischief. So they did what any responsible villagers would, they chopped off his head and burned him. Just to be safe. Historians still argue whether these tales stemmed from misunderstood decomposition or just strong imaginations fueled by long winters and no Netflix. And that's just the beginning. There were spirits that moaned in the wind, said to be souls trapped in purgatory. If you heard them, it meant someone in the village had unconfessed sins. The solution: confession. Or in some towns, lighting 33 candles and leaving bread outside your door. If the bread was gone by morning, the ghost had moved on. Or raccoons had a feast. Toss up, really. Quirky tidbit: in Wales, people believed that if you saw a phantom funeral procession, ghostly figures carrying a coffin, you should never look it in the eye. Why? Because the next funeral would be yours. Entire families moved houses because someone swore they saw a candlelit march through the mist. No one wanted to be next in line. And then there's the tale of the White Lady, a spectral woman dressed in pale robes, often said to be weeping or searching for a lost child. Versions of her exist in dozens of cultures, but in medieval Europe, she often haunted castles, crossroads, and sometimes wells. Her appearance was never random. She was a warning of death, of betrayal, or of unwashed hands, depending on who you asked. One local legend from Austria claims she appeared the night before a nobleman's daughter ran off with a stable boy. The next morning, both were found, let's just say, not running anymore. The church didn't deny these ghosts, by the way. In fact, they sometimes encouraged belief, as long as it served the right purpose. Ghosts were often framed as souls in torment, begging for masses to be said on their behalf. Priests offered special services to ease the suffering of these spirits, usually in exchange for a small donation, of course. Because who doesn't want their loved ones moved up a few cloud levels? But there was another kind of ghost that really rattled medieval bones: the angry dead. These were spirits who had been wronged, murdered, betrayed, buried without rites. They didn't ask for help. They demanded it. Loudly. Through illness, crop failure, or sometimes by literally slapping people awake. One chronicle tells of a nobleman who built his estate over an unmarked plague pit. His family was tormented for months: scratching sounds, hoofbeats on the roof, blood dripping from the ceiling. Eventually, the bishop was called. A full exorcism was performed. The house stood silent afterward, until his youngest son mysteriously disappeared. No body was ever found. Only a small red handprint on the nursery wall. And lest you think ghosts stuck to cemeteries or castles. Oh no, they were known to travel. Especially along corpse roads. These were ancient footpaths used to carry the dead from villages to consecrated burial grounds. Over time, they gained a reputation. Locals swore these paths were haunted. That if you walked them at night, the dead might mistake you for one of their own. That's why people left shoes facing outward by their doors, so ghosts would know the living still lived there. Here's a bizarre one. Some folks believed in talking skulls. Not metaphorically. Actual skulls that whispered warnings, recited prayers, or laughed maniacally if someone approached their resting place. One such legend comes from Devonshire, where a skull kept in a farmhouse was said to scream whenever someone tried to remove it. Naturally, it was left there. For centuries. Probably got its own chair at dinner. You're walking more carefully now, aren't you? Because here, in this foggy dip of the land, the cold presses in, and even the crickets fall quiet. You spot a stone jutting from the ground, an old grave marker, maybe, covered in moss, tilted slightly like it's listening. And you can't shake the feeling that someone else is listening too. Not watching, not moving, just listening. And that's almost worse. The thing is, medieval people didn't fear death in the abstract. They feared what came after. Not heaven. Not even hell, really. They feared being stuck between worlds. Cursed to wander fields and forests, moaning truths no one could hear. Bound by guilt or shame or some forgotten ritual left undone. You couldn't just die. You had to die properly. or risk becoming part of someone else's ghost story. So you keep walking. Avoid stepping on the worn stones. Don't whistle. And if you feel a chill pass over your shoulder, don't turn around. Just keep your eyes forward and your soul inside your body. Because the ghosts, they already know your name. You climb out of the fog basin, breath puffing in the crisp night air, your thoughts still tangled with whispers from the dead. The ground firms beneath your boots, the mist thins, but the dread doesn't. Because as terrifying as ghosts might be, they pale in comparison to something far more tangible in medieval minds: witches. Flesh and blood beings, walking in daylight, hiding in plain sight, and worse, sometimes living next door. Witchcraft wasn't a niche fear. It was a way of explaining everything. A spoiled harvest? Witch. A sudden illness? Witch. Your cow stops producing milk and now it glares at you funny? Definitely a witch. You didn't need proof, you needed suspicion and a good set of lungs for public accusation. And let's face it, medieval towns weren't known for subtlety. Mainstream historical fact: the first full-blown witch trials in Europe began in the 15th century, but the fear goes back much further. Charlemagne passed laws against pagan magic in the 9th century. By the 13th century, the church had blended folk superstitions with religious paranoia, and suddenly, your grandmother's herbal tea looked a lot like sorcery. And what did witches supposedly do? Well, everything. They flew, of course, sometimes on broomsticks, sometimes on pitchforks, sometimes on animals, or even naked in the wind, depending on who was doing the storytelling and how lonely they were. They danced with demons, held midnight Sabbaths, cursed crops, caused impotence, a popular accusation, and brewed storms with frog legs and nail clippings. It was the ultimate one-size-fits-all explanation for life's misery. But here's a quirky belief that'll stick with you. In parts of Eastern Europe, it was thought that witches could steal your shadow. Yes, your literal shadow. Without it, you'd fall ill, grow pale, and eventually die. Farmers were advised never to plow on a cloudy day for fear of someone grabbing their shadow mid-furrow. Historians still argue whether these beliefs stemmed from metaphors of the soul or just too much sunstroke. Of course, being accused of witchcraft wasn't reserved for the cackling hag stereotype. Sometimes it was a healer, a midwife, or a woman who just knew things, like how to treat a fever or when the rain was coming. That sort of wisdom didn't sit well with frightened men in power. And once whispers started, the trial wasn't far behind. Now, let's be clear. Trials were less about truth and more about spectacle. One common method: the water test. Tie the accused hands and feet, throw them into a pond. If they sank, they were innocent, but probably dead. If they floated, they were guilty and burned. Win-win for superstition. Lose-lose for literally everyone else. Another favorite? Searching for a witch's mark. This could be a mole, a scar, even a freckle. Prick it with a needle. If the person didn't cry out, clearly Satan had numbed the spot. In other words, tough people got punished for having high pain tolerance. Medieval logic was truly undefeated. But the real horror was the night visits. Many people believed witches could enter your home as a spirit, or an animal, and sit on your chest, choking the breath from your lungs. Sound familiar? That's because the sensation now called sleep paralysis was once blamed on witches, or their supernatural cousins, the night mares. Ever wonder where that word came from? Yep, that dream where you can't move and feel a crushing weight on your chest? Congratulations! You've just been ridden by a witch. Let's not forget the grimoires, those dusty, dangerous books said to contain spells, incantations, and recipes for disaster. Merely possessing one could get you hanged. Some were real books of herbal knowledge, misunderstood. Others were complete inventions by overzealous clergymen. One notorious title, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, written in 1487, became the manual for witch hunting across Europe. It suggested, among other things, that witches were mostly women because they were weaker in faith and more carnal. Insert exhausted sigh here. And the Sabbaths, those legendary black masses where witches supposedly met at crossroads or mountaintops under full moons, dancing, chanting, and kissing the devil's, special place. Yes, really. That detail gets weirdly specific in trial records. Either those inquisitors had vivid imaginations, or someone needed to lay off the fermented rye. In villages, people protected themselves from witches in surprisingly creative ways. Hanging iron scissors above the door. Nailing a dead toad under the threshold. Drawing protective circles in ash. One English superstition recommended placing a piece of stale bread in your left shoe to ward off curses. It wasn't magic, they claimed, it was counter-magic. And here's one last unsettling twist: not all witches were women. Men were sometimes accused too, especially if they were reclusive, bookish, or just really good at guessing the weather. But statistically, women bore the brunt. Some towns executed dozens, even hundreds, based solely on gossip, bad dreams, or livestock acting twitchy. It was a time when fear became law, and truth was whatever the loudest villager said it was. You hear a snap in the woods now. Just a branch? Or someone watching? The wind carries a dry, whispery sound, almost like laughter. You quicken your pace. Not because you believe in witches, of course, but because you understand now why others did. When life made no sense, when babies died and wells ran dry and frost came in July, someone had to take the blame. And if your neighbor talked to her cat a little too fondly, well, better safe than sorry. The path you follow now winds uphill, a narrow ribbon of earth pressed between leaning trees and the occasional jagged stone poking out like teeth. It's quieter here, not the comforting silence of sleep, but that eerie, held-breath quiet, like the forest is listening, waiting. And as you move beneath the canopy, something in the air shifts. Heavier. Sharper. Because now we're stepping into the world of omens, those cryptic little signs medieval people believed could predict your future, or worse, your death. You think superstitions just tossing salt over your shoulder, or avoiding black cats. Oh, sweet summer child. In the Middle Ages, the whole world was a warning. Everything meant something. Birds, stars, dreams, sneezes, yes, sneezes, were scrutinized like tea leaves in a storm. The trick wasn't just believing in signs. It was surviving because of them. Let's start with birds. To us, they're just morning noise. To medieval folks, they were flying messengers of fate. A raven tapping on your window? Death in the family. A white dove circling your roof. A baby on the way. An owl hooting during the day? Extremely bad news, possibly war, possibly plague, definitely not just a bird being weird. One mainstream historical fact: Roman augury, the practice of interpreting the will of the gods through birds, influenced European thinking well into the medieval period. Watching their flight patterns, noting which direction they came from, even counting how many landed on a tree, all of this was thought to reveal divine truths. Entire decisions, travel plans, weddings, wars, were delayed or fast-tracked based on bird behavior. You thought astrology was extra? But omens weren't limited to the skies. Dreams, for instance, were practically classified intelligence reports. A dream of teeth falling out meant someone would die. A dream of fire foretold passion or destruction, depending on whether you were warm or on actual fire. And the most terrifying of all? Dreaming of a black dog with glowing eyes. That meant the devil was watching you. Or, at the very least, that a demon had taken a particular interest in your bedtime routine. Speaking of dogs, let's talk about the church grim. This fringe belief, still whispered in northern England and Scandinavia, described a black spectral dog that haunted graveyards. It wasn't evil per se, it was a guardian, believed to be the spirit of the first person buried in a new cemetery, often replaced with a sacrificial dog to spare a human soul. So, if you saw a shadowy hound prowling a churchyard, it wasn't just there to scare you, it was working overtime. Historians still argue whether this myth evolved from Norse death deities or local folklore distorted by grief and wolves. But death omens didn't need fur. Sometimes they were as mundane as your own reflection. Some people believed that seeing yourself in a mirror by candlelight, especially on certain nights like All Hallows Eve, could show you a vision of your death. If the candle flickered just right and your reflection moved differently, well, Better start writing your will. Even household accidents carried weight. Spill salt. Doom. Drop a knife. Company's coming. Drop a knife point first. Someone you love is lying. Yes, really. And sneezing. Sneezing was practically a divine telegram. One sneeze might mean someone was thinking of you. 2. Trouble. 3. Witchcraft. It's no wonder people said, "God bless you." They weren't being polite, they were trying to ward off death. Let's get weirder. In certain German villages, people believed that if your right eye twitched, it meant joy was on the horizon. But if the left eye twitched, someone close to you would betray you. One superstitious man reportedly wore a leather eye patch whenever he felt the twitch start, hoping to block the curse. Ironically, he was later accused of sorcery. Apparently, eye protection was suspicious. But perhaps the most haunting omen of all was the corpse candle. Seen in Wales and parts of Brittany, these were small, blue-green flames that hovered just above the ground, usually near water or graveyards. People said they were spirits carrying candles to light the path for the next person to die. See one flicker past your door? That meant you were next. Folks stayed indoors for days after a sighting. One account even claims a man saw a corpse candle float through his bedroom window and died the next morning from an unexplained fever. Coincidence? Sure. But in the medieval mind, coincidence was just fate showing its hand. Let's not forget the calendar omens. Certain days were considered cursed, like the dog days of summer, from early July to mid-August. People believed the heat made the air toxic, driving men mad and causing food to rot in hours. Medical texts warned not to bleed, bathe, or make any major decisions during this time. Basically, just sit still, sweat, and hope for the best. Even birth itself came with signs. A baby born with a caul, a membrane covering the head, was said to have second sight. Lucky, right? Unless the caul was kept improperly. Then it became a cursed object that could drown ships or summon storms. Sailors actually bought dried cauls as talismans, believing they'd prevent drowning. Which, given the state of medieval boats, was an understandable concern. Every sound, every shadow, every strange animal crossing your path, these were signs. Warnings. Codes from a universe that didn't care about your plans. You weren't in control. You were at the mercy of symbols. And here's the kicker. Most people didn't think these omens were magical. They thought they were natural. Just another way the world communicated, like a dog barking before a quake or the sky turning green before a storm. You just had to know how to read the signs, and not anger whatever left them. A soft breeze brushes past your ear. You pause. Did you hear a voice in it? Just your name, maybe. Or maybe nothing. But still, you glance behind you. The moon is higher now, full and watching. A single crow caws in the distance. Then silence. No big deal. Probably just coincidence. Right. You push forward, deeper into the forest where moonlight can't quite reach, and the trees seem older, almost aware. The leaves overhead press in tightly, like they're trying to muffle your footsteps. You get the sense that you're not supposed to be here. Not just because of the dark, but because of what this place used to be. Ground sacred not to saints, but to things much older, and far less forgiving. Tonight, you've wandered into the ancient realm of sacrificial rituals, where blood, bone, and fear were currencies used to barter with the unknown. To us, the idea of sacrificing anything feels extreme. But to the medieval mind, it was simply necessary. God needed offerings. Spirits required appeasement. And sometimes, when storms wouldn't stop, crops refused to grow, or children fell ill in their cradles, the price escalated. Now, mainstream historical fact. By the Middle Ages, human sacrifice had mostly faded from mainstream European religious practice. But, mostly, is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. There were still persistent whispers of secret rites, hidden cults, and desperate acts committed in candlelit groves or forgotten ruins, far from the church's eye. Take the infamous Sin Eater. In parts of Wales and Scotland, a fringe tradition survived into the early modern period. When someone died, a local outcast, usually poor, often strange, would be paid to eat bread and drink ale over the corpse. The belief that the food absorbed the sins of the dead, cleansing their soul. The sin-eater would then carry that darkness away, or be burdened with it forever. Historians still argue whether this practice originated from pagan rites or evolved from early Christian guilt. But it wasn't always symbolic. Some accounts, murky, often second-hand, always chilling, speak of desperate villagers turning to older traditions. In times of extreme famine or plague, stories tell of ritual burials, children gifted to the earth, or even deliberate drownings in sacred springs. These weren't widespread, but they clung to the edges of history like moss to stone, quiet, persistent, hard to scrub away. Let's not forget the foundation sacrifices. When building bridges or cathedrals, it was sometimes believed that a living soul had to be buried in the foundations to ensure the structure's strength. No kidding. In Serbia and Romania, ballads still tell of masons walling in a woman, often a wife or child, so the mortar would hold. The more tragic the offering, the stronger the result. And yes, that belief slithered west. In England, builders sometimes placed animal bones or even human remains in walls, supposedly to ward off collapse or evil spirits. Some unlucky worker dying on site? Suddenly, they became the building's guardian. It's like turning workplace accidents into holy architecture. Efficiency meets superstition. Here's a quirky one for you. In Iceland, there was a belief that you could make a magical object called a nabrok, or necropence. This required flaying the skin from a dead man's lower half, intact, and wearing it like trousers. If done correctly, and with the right magical symbols drawn, coins would appear endlessly in the... well, you can guess where. It was the medieval version of passive income. Horrifying, yes, but undeniably creative. And sacrifices weren't always for gods. Sometimes, they were for land. A community might bury something beneath a newly plowed field, usually a goat or a chicken, but sometimes, something more. One account from 13th century Prussia describes a ritual where a young woman was symbolically married to the soil and buried waist deep in a furrow while seeds were scattered around her. It was meant to encourage fertility in the harvest. She survived. Probably. But even in organized religion, echoes remained. Holy relics were kept in crypts, sometimes bones, sometimes body parts of saints. Touching them was believed to transfer power, to cure disease, or even raise the dead. Pilgrims traveled for weeks to kiss a shriveled toe or stare reverently at a desiccated finger bone. The faith was real, but it also shows how deeply physical sacrifice remained tied to spiritual reward. And then, there were the scapegoats. Not the metaphorical kind. The literal goats. On certain feast days, a village would place all their sins on a real goat, or, in darker variations, a beggar or orphan, parade it through town, and drive it into the wilderness, or beat it, or burn it, depending on local flair. The belief that sin could be transferred like smoke, if only someone was willing to breathe it in. Imagine being the chosen scapegoat. You're told you're cursed, blamed for everything from hailstorms to infertility. Then marched through cheering crowds, lashed with willow branches, and cast out. That's trauma with a festival banner. You hear something snap behind you, a twig, or a footfall. You freeze, listening. Nothing. Just the wind through dry branches, whispering like breath on your neck. You keep walking. There's a mound ahead now, barely visible in the dark. Earth unnaturally smooth, no trees growing on it. These were the kind of places people avoided: barrows, old sacrificial hills, or grave mounds too ancient to date. Medieval people believed these sites still held power. Some placed offerings there: milk, coins, food. Others avoided them entirely, fearing they'd wake something best left buried. There's a Danish legend of a hill where the villagers claimed a girl had been taken by the mound spirits after picking flowers too close to its edge. She returned 3 days later, eyes milk white, never speaking again. She lived, but she wasn't her anymore. And of course, you can't talk sacrifice without fire. Bonfires weren't just celebrations. On Walpurgis Night, Beltane, and All Hallows Eve, people burned effigies, human-shaped bundles of straw or animal bones, to feed the flames. Some believed the smoke carried messages to the gods. Others said it drove out evil spirits. But at the heart of it all was a single belief. Something had to be given for balance to be kept. You pass a charred patch of ground now, blackened roots curling up like claws. Was it lightning? A campfire? Or something older, something that demanded light, and took more than it gave? Because in the medieval mind, safety didn't come from walls or swords or prayers alone. It came from making the right sacrifice, at the right time, in the right way. Fail, and the world could turn on you. You walk a little faster now. Not because you believe in those old rites, but because you're not entirely sure they've stopped. The forest floor softens beneath your feet. Less leaf, more moss, like the land itself is sighing under centuries of secrets. You hear a rustle behind you again, but you don't turn this time. You just keep going, because the deeper you go, the stranger the truths become. And what comes next isn't just bizarre, it's unnervingly close to home. Welcome to the world of medieval medical beliefs, where healing could mean anything from drinking molten gold to rubbing rooster fat on your feet. All in the name of not dying from a toothache. Let's start with a historical fact you probably won't want to remember next time you feel sick. The most trusted medical theory in medieval Europe was the humor system. People believed your body contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and all health problems came from having too much or too little of one. That meant doctors weren't looking to cure symptoms. They were trying to rebalance your juices. Which is charming. If you had a fever, too much blood. You needed bleeding. Coughing too much phlegm. Eat something dry and bitter. Depressed. That'll be too much black bile. Better cheer up with a good purge or, leeches. Always the leeches. Leeches were medieval medicine's little interns, quiet, reliable, and always available. And yes, leeching was very real. Doctors would place them strategically on the body to suck out excess blood, hoping to restore equilibrium. It sometimes worked, usually by sheer coincidence or placebo. Sometimes it didn't, and people just bled out while everyone nodded solemnly. Here's a fringe tidbit that's more medieval madness than medicine. If you had a toothache, one remedy involved kissing a dead man's skull. The theory was that the pain would pass from your living tooth into the empty one. Historians still argue whether this was symbolic folk magic or just desperate improvisation. Either way, it's a hard pass. Of course, not every treatment was gross. Some were just deeply confused. Like the belief that rubbing a live frog on a sore throat would cure it. Or carrying a mole's foot in your pocket to prevent cramps. Or, my personal favorite, tying a weasel to your thigh to ease childbirth. Bonus points if the weasel was still alive. Monasteries were often the centers of healing, and monks were among the most educated medical practitioners. They copied ancient Greek and Roman texts, grew herb gardens, and treated the sick with salves and prayers. And yes, sometimes they knew their stuff. Lavender for calming nerves. Honey for infection. Willow bark for pain, aka medieval aspirin. But even they dipped into the bizarre. One monk's journal recommends drinking eagle bile to cure melancholy. Another swears by urine divination, literally diagnosing disease by the smell, taste, and color of pee. And yes, people paid for that service. Ah, yes, you've got the green-flecked pee. That means your spleen is angry. Here's a goat's liver. Eat it raw. Sanitation, as you can imagine, was a catastrophe. People believed disease traveled through bad air or miasma. So during plagues, doctors stuffed their long-nosed beak masks with flowers and herbs, trying to filter the air. These plague doctors were both terrifying and tragically misguided. They looked like giant crows and mostly succeeded in spreading panic rather than health. But at least the outfits were iconic. Bubonic plague? They thought it came from a celestial alignment or God's punishment. So, naturally, treatments included whipping yourself in the street to show repentance. The flagellants, they were called roving bands of shirtless penitents marching through town, wailing, bleeding, and absolutely not helping. Let's talk home remedies. Your average peasant couldn't afford monks or physicians, so they relied on folk cures passed down through generations. For a headache? Wrap your head in cabbage leaves and chant a prayer to Saint Apollonia. For baldness? Rub your scalp with pigeon droppings and vinegar. For a broken heart? Burn your ex's clothing and mix the ashes into wine. Okay, that one might still be emotionally satisfying. But the line between healing and magic was razor thin. Many people, especially women, were known as wise folk. They practiced herbalism, made poultices, and whispered over wounds. Some were respected, others were feared. And when crops failed or babies died, they were often the first accused of witchcraft. A midwife who lost too many infants might find herself at trial, accused of stealing souls or cursing wombs. There was one cure that was both popular and nightmare-inducing: trepanation. That's right, drilling a hole into your skull to release bad spirits or pressure. And believe it or not, it sometimes worked. Very carefully, with the right tools. And, presumably, a patient who didn't move much. Archaeologists have found trepanned skulls where the bone regrew, meaning people survived this procedure. Just imagine the trust required to let someone carve into your head with an iron spoon. Even animals weren't safe. People believed disease could leap from person to beast and back again. So livestock were often blessed with holy water or smudged with herbs. If a cow stopped producing milk, you didn't check for infection. You accused the neighbor of cursing it. Then you burned hair from both cows, mixed the ash into beer, and made your cow drink it. That was science. The Black Death brought a new wave of fear and creativity. People wore rings engraved with protective prayers, amulets filled with dried herbs. One wealthy merchant is said to have carried a lump of dried toad sewn into his hat to ward off the pestilence. His diary claims he never got sick, probably because he stayed indoors, but sure, go off, Mr. Toadbrain. Of course, this was also an era when astrology and medicine were married. Your zodiac sign determined when to undergo surgery, take medicine, or even bathe. Charts were consulted before every major health decision. A wound to a Pisces? That's a liver issue. A fever during Aries? Better bleed from the forehead. Surgeons literally carried zodiac manuals in their belt pouches. And who were these surgeons? Often barbers. Yup, the guy who cut your hair also cut your leg off. The iconic barber pole? That red and white spiral represents blood and bandages. You went in for a shave and left with your abscess drained. You step carefully over a rotting log now, slick with moss, and feel your stomach lurch. Not from fear, just from thinking about pigeon poop and weasel thighs as valid prescriptions. Still, medieval people weren't stupid. They were trying to make sense of suffering in a world without microscopes or antibiotics. They wanted to live, to heal. And sometimes, miraculously, they did. You walk a little slower now. Not from dread, but from respect. It took guts to survive this kind of medicine. Or a really strong stomach. The deeper you go into this forest of the forgotten past, the more the air changes. Cooler, heavier, as if the trees themselves are holding their breath. Up ahead, the path splits briefly, then curls back together, like two options that always lead to the same place. That's the thing about fear. Whether you face it head-on or try to avoid it, it finds you. Now, let's talk about one of the most quietly terrifying aspects of medieval belief: night spirits and sleep terrors. Yes, even bedtime was a battlefield. Picture this, it's the year 1243. You've spent the whole day working the fields, praying off the plague, and avoiding eye contact with your cousin who thinks your cow is cursed. Finally, you collapse onto a straw mattress. You just want a dreamless, peaceful sleep. But then it comes. A heavy pressure on your chest. You try to scream, but your mouth won't open. Something sits on you, cold, heavy, breathing. And in the morning, you wake up exhausted, terrified, and convinced something unnatural happened. Welcome to the medieval phenomenon of the night hag. The experience we now call sleep paralysis was, in the Middle Ages, absolutely real, but it had nothing to do with brain chemistry. Oh no. It was a demon, usually female, often invisible, sometimes described as a shriveled witch, a black cat, or a toad. She crept in during the night, stole your breath, and rode your chest like a saddle. There's an actual term, incubus for male spirits and succubus for female ones. These creatures weren't just scary, they were seductive. It was widely believed that they could engage in, let's call it uninvited nocturnal activities, leaving the victim drained, diseased, or even pregnant with monstrous offspring. Charming. Historians still argue whether the succubus legend arose purely from sleep paralysis or if it also served as a social excuse, particularly for pregnancies outside of wedlock. It wasn't me, father. It was the demon lady in the moonlight. Well played. You probably won't be shocked to learn that the church had plenty to say about all this. Theologians debated whether demons could physically interact with humans. Some insisted yes, they took flesh, they seduced, they punished. Others said it was illusion, temptation, spiritual weakness. Either way, you were the one on the floor, trying to breathe. And sleep didn't just belong to the demons. There were angels too. Saints. Spirits of the dead. A dream wasn't just a dream, it was a portal. A warning. A message. Dream interpretation was a serious business, especially in monasteries. A bishop dreaming of snakes might fear betrayal. A peasant dreaming of water could expect a death in the family. But back to nightmares, because yes, it gets worse. People believed that witches sent their spirits out while their bodies slept, often in the form of animals, like owls or hares. These spirits would ride horses, tangle manies, steal milk, and sometimes ride humans the way they rode beasts. If you woke up sore and aching, you might have been ridden by a witch. Not metaphorically. Literally. Some even believed they were attending witch sabbaths in their sleep, drawn unwillingly into dark gatherings. Women in particular were accused of dreaming their way into heresy, their very minds seen as playgrounds for the devil. Here's a lesser-known fringe tidbit for your collection. In parts of Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, people believed in something called the mare, a ghost-like creature who sat on your chest and caused nightmares. Sound familiar? That's actually where we get the word nightmare. It's not just a scary dream. It's a thing. A squirmy, breath-stealing thing. Now imagine dealing with that every night, with no electric light, no dream catchers, and definitely no melatonin gummies. Just your wooden door, your crucifix, and the hope that tonight the hag picks someone else. And if you thought you could just stay awake, well, good luck. Because then came the changelings. In folklore, especially Celtic and Germanic, it was believed that fairies, or darker forest beings, could steal sleeping babies and replace them with imposters. These changelings looked like your child but were sickly, fussy, and oddly wise. Some blamed these switches on sudden infant death or unexplained illness. Others suspected them when a baby simply cried too much or didn't grow as expected. To protect a child, mothers might sleep with iron scissors under the pillow, hang herbs above the cradle, or avoid saying the baby's name out loud. Naming gave power, you see. If a fairy knew your name, they could claim you forever. This wasn't just bedtime storytelling. People believed this. There are recorded cases of parents abandoning or even harming children they thought were changelings. It's one of the darker chapters in the already shadowy book of medieval night fears. And adults weren't safe either. There was the fear of soul theft. That while you slept, your soul wandered, and if it couldn't find its way back by dawn, you'd never wake up. So some people tied charms around their necks before bed. Others whispered prayers to Saint Michael, asking him to guide their spirits safely home. Sometimes, people claimed to see wandering souls. A shimmer in the dark. A faint outline near the bed. And if you saw your own soul hovering nearby, well, that meant death was imminent. Sorry. No snooze button for that one. In Icelandic sagas, there's even mention of the fylgja, a kind of spirit double that follows you, often appearing in dreams. Seeing someone else's fylgja was usually a bad omen. Seeing your own? That meant the reaper was scheduling an appointment. Dreams also carried ancestral weight. If your dead grandmother appeared and gave you advice, you were expected to follow it. Ignoring dream warnings was considered both foolish and dangerous, sometimes fatal. And the lines between dream, nightmare, and reality blurred constantly. People awoke from visions of Saint Mary or demonic trials and carried those experiences like memories. Some wrote them down. Others confessed them in church. A few were accused of lying or heresy. But most just quietly added another charm to the bedpost and hoped for better sleep tomorrow. You pass beneath a low-hanging branch now, its bark twisted like the curled spine of some forgotten forest dweller. The night wind sighs, and for a second, you swear it sounds like whispered breathing. Don't worry, it's probably just the mare. Or maybe your filja keeping you company. Better not think too hard about what's sitting at the foot of your bed tonight. You're not sure when the air started to taste like smoke, but here it is now. Dry, bitter, like wood burned too long ago to still see the flames. Somewhere behind you, the sound of a crow caws once, twice, then falls silent. That's when you realize this next part of the story? It smells like fire for a reason. Let's step quietly into the smoky world of hellmouths and the ever-present fear of eternal damnation. In the medieval imagination, hell wasn't a metaphor. It wasn't a vague, theological maybe. It was a place, physical, terrifying, and lurking just beneath the thin crust of the everyday world. And some folks genuinely feared they might fall into it, quite literally, if the ground opened up. Artists of the era painted hell mouths as enormous, gaping jaws, often lined with fangs and fire. These maws devoured the wicked, the doubters, and sometimes just people who asked too many questions at dinner. You'd see tiny figures, naked, screaming, being shoveled in by pitchfork-wielding demons. And yes, the occasional bishop or king made it into the mix too. Medieval artists had a dark sense of humor. But these weren't just illustrations. They were sermons in paint. People would sit in candlelit chapels and stare at walls covered in burning torment, knowing that just one wrong confession, one hidden sin, one skipped tithe might land them in that yawning mouth forever. The real kicker? No one actually knew the checklist for salvation. There were rules, sure, confess, tithe, fast, obey. But the church also taught that grace was mysterious. So, even if you did everything right, you could still end up as demon chow. Historians still argue whether this fear of hell was more psychological control or a genuinely internalized belief. But regardless, it shaped behavior at every level. From kings commissioning chapels to peasants giving up their last loaf of bread just to ensure a priest would pray for their soul. Now, let's talk fire. Medieval people didn't just believe in hellfire, they feared it could break through. Volcanic eruptions, like Mount Etna in Sicily, were often described as gateways to hell. Smoke rising from crevices in the earth? Demons. Earthquakes. Demons. Sinkholes? Guess what? Demonic trapdoors. There's even a fascinating fringe tidbit from 12th century Iceland, where people believed a place called Hekla, a volcano, was literally hell's chimney. Locals said they could hear screaming from inside. Which, yeah, probably just lava and gas. But try telling that to a shepherd who just lost his flock in a fiery tremor. Back in more civilized lands, monasteries often included terrifying vision texts, accounts of people who had died, visited hell, then returned to describe it. These were basically medieval near-death experiences, but spiced up with a lot more fire and eyeballs. One monk, for example, claimed to have seen sinners being eaten by serpents, only to be spat out and devoured again, forever. You pass a mossy stone now, half buried in the soil. On it, carved deep and worn by rain, is a familiar shape, a ring of teeth. Just decoration? Or a warning? Let's look at what actually landed you in those jaws. Pride, lust, gluttony, the usual suspects, sure. But also, asking too many questions about scripture, not tithing enough, sleeping in church, or laughing at the wrong time. Some medieval preachers warned against laughter as a gateway sin. If you weren't constantly solemn, how could you be truly sorry? And hell wasn't just for sinners. Entire professions were suspect. Actors, jesters, millers, even bakers, yes, bakers, were sometimes portrayed as inherently sinful. Because who knows what they're putting in those loaves? A baker in 13th century England was actually fined, and nearly flogged, because his bread was 1 ounce short of the standard. That wasn't just bad business. It was seen as moral corruption. Cheat the poor on bread, and you might find yourself baking in eternal flames. Now, if you were rich, things were negotiable. A nobleman might pay monks to sing masses in perpetuity for his soul, like a medieval subscription plan. The more prayers, the faster you'd move through purgatory, a sort of waiting room between earth and hell. It wasn't paradise, but at least there weren't any pitchforks. Still, for most people, purgatory was terrifying enough. Burning, suffering, endless time to reflect. You didn't escape judgment, you just delayed it. One chilling belief involved the weighing of souls. At the moment of death, it was said that Saint Michael himself would appear with a golden scale. Your sins were placed on one side, your virtues on the other. But tricky demons often tampered with the scale, pushing it down, adding invisible weights. So even in your last moments, you had to pray hard. Or hope your family hired enough monks. And if your soul was especially unlucky, you might become a restless dead, a spirit forced to haunt the living, stuck between worlds. These weren't the helpful ghosts of modern fantasy. They were bitter, smelly, and loud. Like a medieval Yelp reviewer. People feared they'd encounter the restless dead near crossroads, old cemeteries, or places where suicides had occurred. Some villages even built special shrines to pacify them. Others performed midnight exorcisms, chanting Latin and swinging incense until the wind changed direction. And when nothing else worked, they dug up the body, chopped off the head, and stuffed the mouth with a brick. You know, just to be safe. Every time someone died, the community rallied not just to grieve, but to protect themselves from what might come next. Bells were rung to confuse demons. Windows were covered. Dogs were kept indoors, lest they see the departing soul and howl. You can almost hear one of those bells now. Far off, dull, wrapped in fog. And then there was the doom painting. Churches sometimes featured enormous murals right above the exit doors. On one side, saints, angels, golden light. On the other, demons, fire, screaming souls. The message. As you leave this place, remember, your next step might be your last. No pressure, right? Even now, as you walk through this dark medieval landscape in your mind, you might feel a flicker of unease. Because deep down, part of you understands what they feared. That maybe there is a place waiting. That maybe justice doesn't come in this life, but in the next. Just watch your step. The earth here cracks easily. The fog thickens as you move forward, the ground turning softer, swamp-like underfoot. Each step squelches faintly, as if the very earth wants to suck you down. Just a little reminder of where you came from, and maybe where you'll end up if you're not careful. But tonight, you're heading deeper, into a fear that clings to the bones of medieval Europe. The curse of the werewolf and the terror of human-beast hybrids. You've probably heard a dozen Hollywood versions, hairy transformations, full moons, silver bullets. But the medieval werewolf. He was different. Less brooding anti-hero, more full-time nightmare. Back then, the line between man and beast was razor thin. People believed sin could twist the soul so badly that it warped the body, too. And if you strayed too far from the path of God, figuratively or literally, well, you just might sprout a snout. One of the oldest stories comes from 12th century Norman chronicler Gerald of Wales, who swore he met 2 real werewolves in Ireland. Not wild monsters, mind you, talking werewolves. According to him, they were once humans cursed by a saint for violating sacred law, doomed to live as wolves for 7 years before getting their skin back. Historians still argue whether Gerald was recounting folklore or playing a medieval prank on gullible readers. But his detailed tone, matter-of-fact delivery, and priestly authority all suggest he wanted people to take this very seriously. These weren't just bedtime tales, they were moral lessons. The werewolf represented what happened when you abandoned reason, faith, or your place in the social order. And that fear. It bit hard in a world where forests were dark, deep, and filled with howls you couldn't always explain. Now here's your quirky tidbit. In 1521, two French peasants named Pierre and Michel were executed for being werewolves. Their crime. A man claimed they'd attacked him in wolf form. Under torture they confessed, because of course they did, and described rubbing themselves with a magical salve that made them shift into beasts. The town believed them. Because sometimes, the lie was easier than confronting what really drives a man to violence. You see, werewolves didn't just attack livestock. In many medieval records, they targeted children. That was the scariest part. The beast wasn't just a beast, it was a neighbor. Someone who smiled at you in church, helped stack firewood, maybe even watched your kids when you were out harvesting. Then, under cover of night, they became something else. And the worst part? You couldn't always tell. There were warning signs, sure. People whispered that werewolves had bushy eyebrows that met in the middle, unusually long fingers, and hair growing inside their palms. Weirdly specific, right? Some even believed that cutting a suspected werewolf skin would reveal fur underneath. Which is definitely not how biology works, but hey, this was the Middle Ages. A popular belief in Eastern Europe suggested that werewolves were tied to the devil himself. Not just metaphorically. In parts of Germany and the Balkans, it was said that witches summoned them to wreak havoc, especially during sabbats or dark rituals. And sometimes, people believed werewolves weren't even dead after execution. Their souls would leap into other bodies, or worse, haunt the forests as shadow wolves, neither beast nor ghost. You hear a howl now, distant and low. Could be wind. Could be memory. Could be both. Interestingly, not all medieval werewolves were monsters. Some legends painted them as tragic figures. In the 12th century tale of Bisclavret, a Breton knight becomes a wolf because of a magical curse. He's betrayed by his wife, abandoned, and hunted, but remains noble throughout. Eventually, a kind king helps restore him to human form. The moral? Even beasts can have honor, and even humans can be crueler than the wild. Which, if we're honest, is a little comforting and a lot unsettling. Here's a fun little academic wrinkle. Some scholars believe that werewolf trials in the late medieval period were just cover for cases of mental illness, animal attacks, or rural paranoia. Others argue that they symbolized deeper fears about masculinity, violence, and power, especially in times of war and famine. Because when crops failed or armies marched through, people looked for monsters. And sometimes, they found them in themselves. Remember those restless dead from earlier? Well, some were believed to return as wolves. Particularly violent sinners, like murderers or oath-breakers, might rise from the grave in a hybrid form. They'd skulk through the countryside, bleeding from their open wounds, biting at livestock and souls alike. Charming. And if you were bitten, there were rituals. Some priests would perform exorcisms. Others recommended forced fasting, holy water baths, or, no joke, sleeping with a Bible under your pillow and garlic around your neck. The garlic was probably borrowed from vampire lore, but hey, it smelled strong and felt safer than nothing. In parts of France, it was believed that if you walked through a crossroads at midnight and recited a certain Latin chant backwards, you could become a wolf voluntarily. This lycanthrope initiation was tempting to some, because being a beast was, in certain circles, more powerful than being a man. Just imagine the freedom. No taxes, no church, no rules. Just you, your claws, and the moon. Which brings us to that moon. You're probably expecting a full moon to show up here. Surprise, that's a later addition. The medieval werewolf didn't need lunar permission to change. In fact, most stories never mention the moon at all. That came much later, along with silver bullets and tragic shirtless teens. Instead, the transformation was often linked to sin, gluttony, rage, envy. Which makes sense in a world where physical change was seen as divine punishment. You became what you were, deep down. Hairy, ravenous, and without a conscience. The church tried to stomp out these stories. But they couldn't. Because people kept seeing wolves in the woods. And they kept finding bodies, mangled, half-eaten, and too close to home for comfort. You step carefully now, because there's something about a shadow in the trees just ahead. It shifts. then stops. Maybe it's just a deer. Or maybe it's watching you, wondering if you believe yet. And the truth is, you kind of do. Because in this world of fear and faith, of dark woods and darker hearts, the most terrifying thing isn't the idea that a man can become a beast. It's that he might already be one, and no one knows until the blood starts to spill. The ground here is mossy and uneven, your feet brushing over clusters of mushrooms that seem to pulse in the gloom, delicate but suspiciously perfect in shape. There's a hush in the trees now, and the breeze has a new scent, earthy, sweet, almost too sweet. Welcome to the forest of fairy rings and elfin roads, where you learn quickly that stepping into a circle might mean never stepping out again. You probably think of fairies as glittery little wish grantaires. Wings, sparkles, maybe a wand. But in the medieval imagination, fairies were something closer to a supernatural mafia. Unseen, powerful, and very, very territorial. One wrong glance or careless step, and you'd vanish from the world of men, plucked into the shadow realm of the other folk. Fairy rings, those neat, perfect circles of mushrooms, were warning signs, not Instagram moments. Medieval people believed these were doorways, portals, sometimes even traps. If you stepped inside, you might be cursed to dance for eternity, spinning faster and faster until your body gave out and your soul was borrowed. That's a polite word. Let's not say harvested. One old Welsh tale warns of a shepherd who stumbles into a fairy ring while chasing a lamb. Inside, he finds a dazzling court of glowing beings, music like bells underwater, and dancing that feels like flying. He joins them, just for a moment, he thinks. But when he finally stumbles out, panting and dazed, he's missing 2 fingers, and 2 centuries have passed. Historians still argue whether these stories were metaphors for epilepsy, dissociative states, or perhaps some clever hallucinogenic mushroom encounters. But the consistency of these tales across Europe, from Scotland to Sicily, suggests something deeper. A shared fear of crossing unseen boundaries, and being punished for curiosity. There's a fringe theory, whispered more than taught, that fairy lore was a memory of older, pre-Christian nature gods pushed underground, both literally and culturally. These weren't Tinker Bells. These were spirits of earth and stone, sky and storm, who didn't like being forgotten. So they found new ways to make their presence felt. And they were not fans of being disrespected. People left offerings, milk, honey, bread, on thresholds and tree stumps. Not to be polite, but to avoid retaliation. If your child fell ill suddenly, if milk soured overnight, if your crops wilted or your sheep wandered into the mist and never came back, it was probably the fairies. The old kind. The dangerous kind. Oh, and never say, fairy, out loud. That was a good way to get cursed. Folks preferred euphemisms. The good people, the gentry, them that walk behind the hill. Because if you talked about them, they might listen. And if they listened, well, best case? They borrowed your baby. Yes, fairy abduction was very real in the medieval mind. Infants were considered especially vulnerable. Mothers kept iron scissors under pillows, tied red ribbons around cradles, and avoided going outside after dusk, just to keep the changeling away. A changeling was a substitute. A sickly, strange creature left in the cradle while your real child was whisked away to the fairy realm. People said you could tell by its behavior, crying all night, refusing food, or speaking in an adult voice. And the remedy? You might not want to know. In Ireland and parts of Germany, there are records of people burning, beating, or starving so-called changelings to force the fairies to return the real baby. A tragic blend of folklore and fear, and a grim reminder that sometimes, belief has consequences that echo long past the bedtime story. But not all interactions were malevolent. Some tales speak of humans seduced into fairy dances, euphoric, golden-lit nights where time stopped and joy overflowed. Poets and dreamers who returned changed, gifted with music or madness. Like the story of Thomas the Rhymer, a Scottish bard who vanished for 7 years into the court of the fairy queen, only to return with prophetic powers and an unshakable gaze. Of course, that came with a catch. He couldn't lie again. Ever. Which made him a terrible drinking companion and a pretty decent prophet. You might wonder, If everyone was so scared, why didn't the church just ban all this? Oh, they tried. But fairy belief was stubborn. Priests preached against it, but farmers still left cream at the crossroads. Monks wrote about demons masquerading as spirits of the wood, but secretly blessed homes built near fairy hills. Because sometimes, it was better to cover all your bases. One particularly odd historical fact. In 1300s France, royal courts heard multiple legal cases involving fairy interference. Yes, real lawsuits. My cow vanished near a known ring. My child changed overnight. The court didn't always believe, but they listened. Which says something about how deep these fears ran. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some medieval maps actually labeled fairy hills as dangerous terrain, warning travelers not to linger. One popular legend warned of a knight who slept inside such a hill and woke up, with his armor rusted through and his horse nothing but bones. Time moves funny, where the gentry dance. Scholars still debate whether fairy lore was a coded way to talk about mental illness, dreams, or even grief. Perhaps losing someone suddenly, be it to death or madness, was easier to bear if you believed they'd gone somewhere enchanted. Somewhere just beyond reach. You feel a breeze stir again, and a cluster of mushrooms tremble near your left boot. Don't step inside. Just walk gently around. The moss is thick here. Soft, like a carpet. Like a lure. In some places, people still tiptoe past certain trees. Still leave milk on windowsills. Still hesitate when a child starts singing a tune no one taught them. Maybe it's just nostalgia. Or maybe something older is listening. Watching. Waiting for someone to forget the rules. So here's your reality check. In the medieval world, not all monsters were bloodthirsty beasts. Some were beautiful. Some glowed. Some smiled as they took your hand and danced you right out of time. And if you're lucky, you might dance back again. But don't count on it. You're climbing now, stones loose underfoot, air thinner, tinged with iron. The path winds past jagged rocks that jut like broken teeth, and there's a strange hush up here. It's not silence exactly. It's more like held breath. The kind that says you shouldn't be here. And definitely not after dark. This is where the medieval mind met the edge of the world. Where mountains became mouths, and echoes meant something was listening. We've reached the realm of giants and sleeping kings, two very different myths sharing the same towering landscapes. To medieval peasants and nobles alike, the highlands weren't just remote. They were mysterious, dangerous, sacred, and, sometimes, very much alive. Let's start with the giants. Big, dumb, and always angry, right? Well, sort of. But not always dumb, and definitely not always malevolent. In places like Cornwall, northern Spain, and the Carpathians, tales persist of mountain-sized beings who shaped the world, literally. That valley you just crossed? A footprint. That boulder near the river? Tossed during a grudge match between two colossi. Mountains themselves were said to be sleeping giants, buried under stone, waiting for some divine wake-up call. One particularly stubborn story from 13th century Norway claimed that trolls weren't just lurking in caves, they were the caves. Petrified by sunlight, frozen mid-stride as they tried to snatch sheep or, occasionally, a bishop. Historians still argue whether such tales were efforts to explain geological formations or warnings to stay home at night. Either way, it worked. And then you have the sleeping kings. Not gods. Not quite men. Something in between. King Arthur is the most famous, of course. Not dead, just resting beneath a hollow hill, sword by his side, waiting for Britain's hour of need. But he wasn't the only one. Across Europe, you get a recurring myth of the noble hero in magical stasis. Frederick Barbarossa beneath the Kyffhauser Mountains, Charlemagne slumbering in Aachen, even a Polish knight in a golden armor, snoozing beneath Gywant Peak. Now here's your mainstream historical fact. These sleeping kings usually rose in popularity during times of crisis. Plague, invasion, famine. The myth filled a psychological gap. When hope was thin and leadership weak, people liked imagining a legendary ruler waiting to return. Not in spirit. Not symbolically. Physically. Sword swinging, horse galloping, army behind him. Like King Arthur with a Red Bull. There's a wonderfully quirky tidbit from Germany. Locals near the Kyffhauser Mountains say Frederick Barbarossa's beard is still growing. It's supposedly curled twice around the stone table he sleeps beside. When it loops a third time, boom, he wakes up. Though, fair warning, if he does return, you're probably in the middle of a very, very bad war. So why do these sleeping king myths persist? Scholars still debate whether they're political allegories, echoes of older resurrection myths, or just incredibly stubborn wishful thinking. Some link them to apocalyptic prophecy. Every culture loves a good return of the hero arc. Others suggest these kings weren't ever human to begin with, but recycled deities turned into national mascots. Interestingly, there's overlap between sleeping kings and fairy realms. In some Welsh versions, Arthur isn't underground. He's in Avalon, a mystical island accessed through mist and time. Which means he might technically be in a fairy ring. Wearing chainmail. Holding Excalibur. Don't disturb him unless you're absolutely sure you need backup. Mountains also carried warnings of sound. Echoes were considered ominous, not fun. If your voice bounced back too clearly, it might mean something was imitating you. Something listening. Some medieval monks even wrote about echoes as voices of the damned, trapped in the rock, crying out. So next time you're hiking and hear yourself yell back? Yeah, don't. But mountains weren't just homes to sleeping kings or stone-faced giants. They were places where reality felt thin. Stories swirled of disappearing shepherds, glowing lights at the peaks, and strange music that lured you uphill until you vanished forever. In the Alps, it was said you could see ghost processions walking single file along ridgelines, especially during storms. No one knew who they were, but everyone knew not to follow. One especially eerie tradition in Romania involved the Munteal Reis, or Cold Mountain, where local villagers refused to climb certain slopes after sunset. They believed the summit held a gate, not metaphorical, a real threshold between worlds. Cross it and you might return changed. Or not at all. Some of these beliefs trickled into travel customs. In certain areas, mountain crossings were done in silence. No whistling. No talking. You didn't want to draw attention. Or wake something that should stay dreaming. Oh, and don't forget about the mountain dragons. Yes, dragons again. But these ones weren't fire-breathing. More like massive serpents that lived in deep valleys or inside glaciers. In Armenia and the Pyrenees, stories circulated about giant, snake-like creatures that slithered across peaks, bringing storms in their wake. Were they real animals, distorted through legend? Meteorological metaphors? Or something else? One theory, half fringe, half fun, claims that the dragon myths and sleeping king tales evolved together. That the kings weren't alone. That their eternal rest was guarded. By beasts. By enchantments. By curses so old even the rocks forgot the words. Which would be very inconvenient if you accidentally triggered one by, say, planting a flag or building a ski resort. There's something deeply human about turning peaks into temples and monarchs into myths. You look up at a mountain and feel small, and maybe a little stupid for trying to conquer it. So you fill it with meaning. With stories. With sleeping titans and time-stretched rulers who'll come back when things get really bad. But here's your cheeky reality check. If Arthur does wake up, it probably means something truly horrible has happened. Nuclear level. Zombie apocalypse. England losing Eurovision, again. So maybe, just maybe, let the kings keep sleeping. Let the giants stay stone. And if you hear a song on the wind or see a blue light above a summit, turn around. Go home. The mountain doesn't want you today. Your path now leads through shifting fields where the grass grows taller than your knees and the wind seems to hum with ancient secrets. Here, the world feels in between. Part dream, part danger. You spot strange symbols carved into standing stones and bundles of twigs tied high in tree branches, too deliberate to be accidents. This is where you encounter the cults, curses, and secret rites that the medieval world tried to bury, sometimes literally. You probably think of medieval religion as all cathedrals and incense and men in robes chanting Latin. And yes, a lot of it was exactly that. But beneath the church bells and public prayers, there were whispers. There were other practices. Darker ones. Private ones. Secret rites that promised power, protection, or vengeance, for a price. Let's start with curses, the magical boomerangs of the medieval world. If someone wronged you, stole your cow, seduced your husband, blocked your inheritance, you didn't necessarily run to the village priest. Sometimes, you walked much farther. Into the woods. To a place where a certain woman lived. You didn't say her name out loud, but you knew she could help. For a price. This woman might be called a cunning woman, a wise wife, or if the local rumors were particularly nasty, a witch. She knew which herbs burned blue in the fire and which ones made your enemies grow boils. She didn't need a book. She had experience. And a notebook, if she was organized. In England, one popular curse involved baking a heart-shaped loaf of bread, piercing it with pins, and chanting the victim's name backward while burying it at a crossroads. Very Pinterest, very medieval murder mystery. In Germany, there were curse bowls, tiny clay pots inscribed with hexes and buried near a target's home. Some were found centuries later, filled with nails, teeth, and once, disturbingly, a mummified mouse. Historians still argue whether these curses were real in their effects, or just psychological warfare. But the fear was real. And belief. Oh, that was the most powerful ingredient. Now, onto secret cults, and we're not talking about horror movie satanic gatherings. Think smaller. Stranger. Fringe Christian splinter groups that believed Jesus had already returned in secret, or that the world was about to end, again. One such group in 14th century Bohemia believed all church property should be burned and everyone should live like wild animals until the second coming. Shockingly, they weren't invited to many parties. The church tried to stomp these groups out, of course. But persecution only made them more secretive. Meetings were held in caves or abandoned barns. Passwords were whispered. Symbols carved into tree bark or scratched under rocks guided members to gathering sites. This wasn't cosplay. It was survival. And sometimes, it turned violent. One fringe sect, the Brethren of the Free Spirit, believed they had achieved perfect spiritual union with God, which meant they could do whatever they wanted. Yes, whatever. Including theft, nudity, and the occasional orgy. You can imagine how well that went over with the bishops. The movement was condemned, naturally, but not before it spread across parts of France and the Low Countries like wildfire. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Many of these heretical groups were hunted and executed by inquisitions not for violence, but for disobedience. They challenged church hierarchy. They claimed a direct line to God. That was more dangerous than any spell or sword. As for rituals, those weren't limited to secret cults or forest witches. Even average villagers performed strange rites, half-remembered from pagan times. In parts of Scotland, people still left milk on stone altars to appease ancient spirits well into the 1500s. In Poland, farmers walked their fields backward on certain moonless nights to confuse evil spirits. And in southern Italy, there was a tradition of tarantella dancing, allegedly to cure spider bites, but suspiciously specific in its rhythms and rituals. Scholars suspect it had deeper roots, possibly pre-Christian trance practices masked as medicine. Let's not forget the curse tablets, actual sheets of lead inscribed with tiny, angry writing and folded up like malicious origami. These were often thrown into wells, left in graves, or hidden under doorsteps. One Roman-British example curses a thief named Secundus, and prays that he never sleep, eat, or urinate in peace, until he returns a stolen cloak. Petty. Maybe. Effective. Who's to say? But the medieval version of a bad Yelp review was a bit more intense. Here's a fun fringe tidbit. In the 1300s, several bishops complained about the rise of necromantic students at universities, young men using their access to books and ink to try summoning demons between classes. Imagine Hogwarts, but with worse hygiene and more exorcisms. Of course, the line between magic and religion was thin. Really thin. Pilgrimages often included amulets. Relics were wrapped in herbs. Saints' bones were said to sweat healing oil, and sometimes they were fed to the sick in powdered form. Yes, bone smoothies. You can't make that up. The church tried to draw lines. Magic bad, miracles good. But when both involved strange rituals and whispered Latin, the average peasant just nodded and did both. You might say a prayer and hang a rowan branch above the crib. Just to be safe. Just in case. It was the original spiritual multitasking. One curious historical record from Iceland describes a man carving runes onto a whale bone, burying it near a neighbor's house, and waiting for their luck to turn sour. The neighbor's crops died, his dog went blind, and he moved within the year. Was it the runes? Or bad weather? You decide. Scholars still debate whether these practices were remnants of pagan traditions or homegrown superstitions. Likely both. The medieval world was full of unseen forces, and people wanted control. If lighting a candle this way while muttering that phrase helped you sleep better, you did it. If burning a lock of hair in a black bowl stopped your rival from marrying your crush, worth a try. So here's your soft little reality check. Medieval people weren't dumb or delusional. They were just deeply invested in survival. When medicine was leeches and politics was swords, a well-timed curse or protective charm felt like insurance. And honestly, can you blame them? You feel the breeze shift again. A stone under your foot bears a faint, scratched mark, circle inside a triangle. Maybe just a bored shepherd. Or maybe something older. Best not to linger. Walk on. The woods behind you fall silent, and ahead lies a village that looks frozen in time. Timber-framed cottages, crooked chimneys, and smoke curling into the dusk like soft, ghostly fingers. But this is no peaceful pastoral retreat. This place has known plague. And here, in the ashes of terror, you uncover the twisted myths surrounding disease and punishment, where illness wasn't just a misfortune, it was a cosmic reckoning. You walk past shuttered windows painted with crude red crosses. Outside one cottage, a bundle of herbs hangs from the lintel, rosemary, sage, and maybe something less identifiable. Inside, the air feels thick with absence. This place lost people, and what they believed about why is both haunting and fascinating. In the medieval imagination, disease wasn't just random. It was punishment, divine wrath, unleashed on sinful towns or wayward souls. The Black Death, especially, was seen as a holy retribution. Not surprising, given that it wiped out nearly half the population of Europe between 1347 and 1351. People didn't just panic, they tried to reason with it. Unfortunately, the reasoning led to some disturbing conclusions. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Many believed the plague was caused by miasma, or bad air. Not exactly germ theory, but not far off. They'd carry pomanders, tiny balls filled with cloves or lavender, to sniff instead of breathing in the deadly fog. Some even wore strange bird-like masks stuffed with herbs. Yes, those plague doctor outfits. Iconic and deeply unsettling. But beyond the air theory, darker beliefs festered. Some thought the plague came from God's rage, a cosmic spanking for humanity's pride, lust, or failure to observe Lent properly. It didn't help that entire regions ignored public health orders. Towns that partied during feast days? Absolutely smited. Coincidence? You decide. Others pointed fingers at outsiders. Jews, lepers, beggars, anyone who looked different or couldn't defend themselves. In 1348, in Strasbourg, over 2,000 Jews were burned alive after being blamed for poisoning wells. No evidence, of course. Just hysteria. But in the medieval mind, scapegoats were a form of spiritual hygiene. Historians still argue whether this mass paranoia stemmed more from fear or from existing prejudices that found their excuse in disease. Likely both. Either way, myth turned deadly. And then came the flagellants. You hear the sound before you see them, a rhythmic slap-slap of leather on skin. Men, shirtless and bleeding, parading through town squares with whips, chanting hymns, and calling down mercy. These were the flagellants, religious zealots who believed that self-punishment could lift divine anger. Their processions often grew to hundreds. They whipped themselves until blood soaked the cobblestones, hoping that their pain might spare the innocent. Or at least impress God enough to slow the plague. Did it work? Of course not. But for many, watching someone beat themselves to near death was more comforting than silence. At least someone was doing something. Not all beliefs were violent. Some were just weird. In parts of Germany, people believed dancing could ward off the plague. So they held spontaneous dance vigils, which, as you might guess, didn't always end well. One 16th century case in Strasbourg involved hundreds of people dancing for days without rest. Some collapsed. Some died. Historians still debate whether this was mass hysteria, poisoned grain, or a spiritual movement gone rogue. The truth still twirling in the dark. Fringe tidbit: in rural France, some families buried live toads under their doorsteps to suck the sickness out of the home. The toads, tragically, did not survive. But their martyrdom was appreciated. You turn a corner and see a public well. Once, a gathering place. Now, it's just a hole in the stone. In the plague years, people believed wells could carry sin, or be cursed. A dropped rosary might lead to fever. A shadow crossing your reflection could mean death within days. One English tale tells of a weeping well that turned to blood before a village outbreak. Was it algae? Or was it a warning? Ask a medieval peasant, you'd get a whisper and a cross made quickly over the heart. Your foot brushes against something in the grass. A dried-out doll, handmade from straw and feathers. Not for play. It's a plague effigy. People made them to trap illness, leaving them outside the door like a spiritual scarecrow. Some were burned at dawn. Others were tied to the ankles of pigs and chased into the woods. Why pigs? Because pigs were believed to draw evil away. They were the medieval emotional support animal, until they ran screaming into the brush with a doll tied to their foot. Medieval cities tried real prevention, too: quarantines, border patrols, even isolation ships. Venice famously enforced a 40-day isolation for incoming vessels. That's where we get the word quarantine, from 40 giorni, 40 days. So hey, your 2020 lockdown had some Renaissance vibes. But for many, these measures weren't enough. They needed a story, a myth. Something to explain why their neighbor coughed on Monday and was buried by Thursday. Why their priest got sick despite prayer. Why their child's fever wouldn't break. And when the church couldn't give answers, folklore stepped in. One chilling belief was the plague specter, a ghostly woman in black who passed through towns before outbreaks. She'd knock 3 times on a door, and whoever answered would be dead within a week. In some versions, she wore a veil. In others, she had no face at all. Children were told not to answer unfamiliar knocks, even in daylight. Because you never knew when the plague lady might call. And then there was the idea that rats weren't just carriers, but possessed. In parts of Eastern Europe, people believed diseased rats were animated by dark spirits or sent by enemy sorcerers. One Hungarian tale tells of a man who trapped a plague rat and heard it speak his name before it died. Probably just squeaking. Probably. So you keep walking. Past houses with crumbling doorframes and long-dead rose bushes. You feel the weight of all the stories people told to make sense of devastation. Because when science was lacking and God was silent, myth filled the void. And sometimes, myths were the only thing keeping people sane. As night thickens, the village fades behind you. You're not sick, but you feel a chill. You tighten your coat, just in case the air isn't entirely safe. And if you hear 3 knocks on your door tonight, well, best not to answer. The moon glints off the surface of a wide, sluggish river. You follow its path as it winds through damp meadows and into the woods beyond. And there, in the thicket of trees and moss-laced stones, you enter a world where witches, werewolves, and walking corpses weren't just stories, they were neighborhood threats. Welcome to the realm of medieval supernatural fear. You move quietly now, not because you expect to see anything, but because people in the Middle Ages sure thought something might be watching. And if the legends are right, that something might be wearing your neighbor's face. Let's start with witches. Not the quirky, herb-loving types you find in modern pop culture, but real, terrifying agents of the devil, as feared by townsfolk and clergy alike. In medieval Europe, especially from the 13th century onward, people started to believe that witches formed covenants with demons, cast harmful spells, and caused everything from failed crops to sudden deaths. And yes, they were blamed for storms, milk curdling, and even impotence. Tough week. Probably a witch. Mainstream historical fact: by the 15th century, church-backed inquisitions and civic trials for witchcraft were widespread. One of the most infamous manuals, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, was published in 1487 and instructed judges on how to detect, try, and execute witches. Spoiler alert, it wasn't big on fair trials. It was like a medieval version of Yelp, but every review ended with a bonfire. But centuries before the famous witch hunts, whispers about night-flying women and moon dancers were already circulating. People claimed that witches could steal your soul while you slept, or ride your chest like a horse. Yes, that was an actual fear, being ridden in your dreams. Sleep paralysis? Science would later have something to say. But back then, it meant your spirit had been hijacked for a wild midnight Sabbath. Some stories were even stranger. A fringe tidbit: in parts of Scandinavia, it was believed that witches could turn into cats, not just familiars. If you kicked a stray feline and later got cursed with boils, everyone knew why. This belief was so ingrained that even today, some old Swedish proverbs warn about treating black cats with respect, or else. You step over a half-rotted log and glance into the trees. What if something's watching? What if it's not quite human? Enter the werewolf. You probably picture moonlit howling, shredded clothes, and bad CGI. But medieval werewolves were much weirder. Forget silver bullets, they weren't even always bad. Some stories treated werewolves as cursed knights, misunderstood protectors, or even God's secret agents. Others, not so much. In 12th century England, chroniclers wrote of a priest who met a talking werewolf in the woods. The creature claimed to be from a tribe of cursed Christians, exiled for their sins, condemned to live as wolves but still loyal to God. It's one of the oldest sympathetic werewolf tales. Historians still argue whether it was political allegory or pure delusion, but either way, someone in medieval England believed it was worth writing down. More commonly though, werewolves were feared as cannibalistic monsters. One 14th century French tale told of a woman who caught her husband removing his belt and turning into a wolf. He roamed the woods by night, eating babies and hunting livestock. When he failed to return one day, she remarried. But then a mangled wolf corpse turned up, wearing his belt. Awkward. And yes, belts. In medieval lore, a magical belt or pelt was often the source of the transformation. Lose it, and the spell broke. Sounds like a video game mechanic, but they believed it, deeply. Some towns even banned wearing wolfskin clothing for fear it could trigger a change. Open scholarly debate. Was werewolf belief tied to real disorders, like hypertrichosis or rabies, or was it social control disguised as folklore? Some say it gave moral shape to behaviors society couldn't explain. Others argue it was just what happens when people don't get enough sunlight and read too many gloomy sermons. You keep moving, deeper into the brush. The ground turns mushy. A faint sound behind you. Nothing, you tell yourself. But remember what we said about walking corpses? Because yes, in medieval Europe, people believed the dead didn't always stay politely buried. There were tales of revenants, animated corpses that returned from the grave to torment the living. Not quite zombies. Not quite ghosts. Just your local ex-farmer climbing out of his plot to curse your crops or breathe death into your oxen. In one 12th century English story, a revenant was a wealthy landowner who rose nightly from his grave and stalked the village. People said his corpse groaned, smelled awful, shocking, and made people sick just by looking at them. Eventually, the bishop ordered his body dug up and reburied with a stake through the heart. No more visits after that. Sound familiar? Yes. Long before Dracula, people were already staking corpses. In fact, that practice predates even Christianity. But medieval Europeans took it to new levels: decapitation, iron nails, burning the heart, or burying a corpse upside down, just to be sure. And in Eastern Europe, whole cemeteries were filled with anti-vampire precautions. People believed in strigoi, undead spirits that sucked vitality. You didn't need fangs or a cape, just unresolved sins and a poorly secured casket. If a baby was born with a caul over its face, it was marked for the strigoi life. Lucky kid. There's even a medieval myth that if a black dog jumped over a corpse, it would rise. So some villages placed iron cages, mort safes, over graves to keep dogs out and the dead in. That's not just superstition. You can still find those cages in parts of Scotland. Some revenants weren't malicious. They just needed help. One tale from Germany tells of a boy who returned to ask his family to donate a loaf of bread to the poor, then he could rest. So they did. And he didn't come back. Lesson: always feed the ghost kid. As you reach the edge of the forest, the moon is high, casting long shadows. The kind of shadows that make you walk faster without admitting why. You think of those who once lived by candlelight, who peered into the dark and saw monsters, because it was easier than seeing nothing. So yes, witches, wolves, and walking corpses. But more than that, they saw reflection in the dark. Fear, guilt, grief, desire, power, all shaped into forms they could fight. Or burn. Or bury. The wind picks up. It rustles the trees like whispers. You pull your cloak tighter. The road is just ahead. Safer ground. Fewer legends. Unless you hear breathing behind you. The dawn light filters softly through stained glass windows as you enter a small, ancient chapel standing quietly on a hill overlooking the village below. The air is heavy with the scent of incense and old stone, mingling with faint echoes of whispered prayers. Here, in this sacred space, you confront the deeply entwined fears and myths of medieval spirituality. How the Church's teachings both soothed and stoked terrors in equal measure. You kneel beside a weathered wooden pew, letting your mind wander through the echoes of sermons once preached here. You might assume the Church was purely a beacon of hope in those dark times, but the truth is more tangled. Medieval faith was often a double-edged sword, a source of comfort, but also a wellspring of anxiety. Here's your mainstream fact. The Church taught that sin could manifest in physical and supernatural punishment. Illness, misfortune, and death weren't random acts but signs of spiritual failure or divine retribution. Confession and penance were ways to heal the soul, and sometimes the body. But that spiritual framework could be terrifying. Many believed their eternal fate depended on the right prayers, the proper rituals, and the constant battle to avoid temptation. Hell wasn't just a distant idea, it was painted vividly in sermons, with flames licking and demons clawing at the condemned. If you were a sinner, you might be next. Now, the quirky side. Some clergy developed bizarre customs to ward off evil or explain the unexplained. In parts of Europe, priests carried around holy relics, bones of saints, bits of the true cross, or vials of holy water, that were believed to have real power to stop witches, demons, and disease. One relic, the so-called holy thorn, was a single thorn from Christ's crown of thorns, said to bleed when in danger. Parishioners lined up for hours just to touch it, hoping to absorb a drop of protection. You might wonder, were these relics authentic? Historians still argue whether many were genuine or clever forgeries. But for the medieval mind, their power was real, because belief was power. The Church's role in shaping myths went deeper. It framed the narrative of good versus evil, angels versus demons, saints versus sinners. This narrative helped people make sense of their hardships but also created lasting fears. For example, the idea of demonic possession became widespread. People thought that mental illness, seizures, or strange behavior might mean the devil was inside you, needing exorcism. You stumble upon an old text, faded and fragile, describing the signs of possession: speaking in tongues, unnatural strength, aversion to holy objects. Sound familiar? This was the medieval diagnosis of madness, or the spiritual explanation for it. Some priests performed dramatic exorcisms involving prayer, holy water, and sometimes physical restraint. A fringe tidbit: In some monasteries, monks believed that demonic spirits could invade not only people but also animals and even objects. A possessed horse could throw its rider or cause accidents. A cursed chalice might bring death to whoever drank from it. This belief led to rituals for cleansing everyday items, an idea that sounds a lot like modern superstition but was deeply institutionalized. Historians still debate whether these beliefs helped people cope with mental and social illnesses or perpetuated misunderstanding and fear. Probably a bit of both. You rise from the pew, feeling the weight of centuries of faith and fear in this place. The church offered salvation but demanded vigilance, obedience, and sometimes sacrifice. It was the ultimate authority on what was real and what was monstrous. As you step outside, the morning sun warms your face. You look back at the chapel, its walls silent witnesses to countless stories of hope, despair, and everything in between. You realize that the myths you've walked through, from plague curses to werewolves, from witches to revenants, were all part of the same human attempt to explain the inexplicable, to find meaning in suffering, and to hold on to hope. The medieval world was a landscape of shadows and light, where belief could protect you or damn you, where the line between reality and myth was as thin as a whispered prayer. And now, as you walk away from this ancient place, the stories linger softly behind you, fading like the last notes of a chant. Take a deep breath. You've traveled through some of the darkest corners of human imagination and fear. But remember, those myths, terrifying as they were also a testament to resilience. To the human need to tell stories, to find comfort in community, and to keep the flame of hope alive even in the darkest times. So, let your eyelids grow heavy, the shadows soften, and your mind drift gently into rest. You're safe now. The darkness outside your window is quiet. The myths have faded, leaving only the soft hum of night and the promise of a new dawn. Let your breath slow. Feel the calm settling in, like a gentle tide pulling away the fears of the day. Sleep well, friend.